So welcome everybody. Thank you all for taking out the time to join us on this Tuesday evening or afternoon if you're joining us from the West Coast. My name is Monserrat Oni, and I am here working with In Our Own Voice Action Fund to bring you this speaker series, Rooted in Power. And so the point of this speaker series was really to share share the message of reproductive justice and also give people the tools necessary to be active in your local communities around reproductive justice. So we're incredibly excited for our panel today. We have three fantastic panelists that will be chatting with you on tonight's topic. So first we have Dr. Regina Davis Moss. Dr. Regina Davis Moss is the president and CEO of In Our Own Voice Action Fund. Working at the intersection of public health, media, and culture change, Dr. Moss has dedicated her entire life and career to fighting for one goal: empowering women and adolescent girls to make healthy decisions about the urgent challenges facing them every day. Regina is a health equity, sexuality, and reproductive health expert that uses her nonprofit, private sector, and political experience to make communities places that welcome and support everyone. Also tonight, we have Ericka Hart. Ericka Hart is a Black queer femme activist, writer, highly acclaimed speaker, and award-winning sexuality educator with a Master's of Education in Human Sexuality from Widener University. Ericka's work broke ground when she went topless, showing her double mastectomy scars in public in 2016. Since then, she's been in demand at colleges and universities across the country, featured in countless digital and print publications like Vogue, Washington Post, Allure, Harper's Bazaar, Vice, Paper Mag, BBC News, Cosmopolitan, Vanity Fair, W Magazine, Glamour, Elle, and Essence, and I'm sure even more. Ericka's voice is rooted in leading edge thought around human sexual expression as inextricable to overall human health and its intersections with race, gender, chronic illness, and disability. Both radical and relatable, she continues to push well beyond the threshold of sex positivity. Ericka has taught sexuality education for elementary-aged youth to adults across New York City for over 10 years, including for 4 years at Columbia University School of Social Work and the CUNY School of Public Health at Hunter College. They are currently an adjunct faculty member at Widener University's Human Sexuality, a bratty, switchy Sagittarius service bottom, and Mrs. Whitney more than you. And lastly, but absolutely not least, we have Dr. Toni Bond. Dr. Toni M. Bond is a professor of ethics at Methodist Theological School in Ohio and the CEO of Interfaith Voices for Reproductive Justice, a national faith-based reproductive and sexual justice organization that works with religious scholars, religious leaders, and grassroots activists to create a culture shift around issues of religion and reproductive and sexual justice. In 1994, Dr. Bond was one of the 12 Black women who gave birth to the concept of reproductive justice, and we honor these women by referring to them as the founding mothers. A womanist ethicist, her areas of specialization include classical, Christian, and womanist ethics, gender and sexuality, reproductive health, rights, and justice, Black feminist theory and methodology, and womanist theory and methodology. Her scholarly foci are reproductive justice and women of color, religion, faith, and reproductive justice, and womanist theoethics and reproductive justice. So thank you for being here. Thank you all participants. And we're really excited to get into this conversation. So first off, going to pass it off to Dr. Davis Moss to talk to us about In Our Own Voice Action Fund.
Well, hello, everyone, and thanks again for joining. Let me just say, the In Our Own Voice Action Fund, it's a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that's working to advance reproductive justice and defend human rights. We're going to get into what reproductive justice is in a minute, but the name might sound a little familiar, and that's because it's the sister arm to In Our Own Voice National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda. Now, that's been around for 10 years, and that's a powerful convening of Black women-led organizations that are focused unapologetically on Black women, girls, and gender expansive people. And we are 365 amplifying our collective voice to advocate for reproductive justice. Now, let me get back to the Action Fund, which is what is it that we do? So what we're doing through our Action Fund is we're educating and we're organizing the public. We're registering and we're informing and mobilizing voters. We're promoting a comprehensive, proactive policy agenda that really does say, you know what, these are the issues that Black women, girls, and gender expansive people are facing, and this is how you solve them. You know, we've got the blueprint. And you might say, well, how is that different? Well, how we're different is that we are actually working with the legislators, and we are actually doing very important right now during election season, promoting political candidates that are committed to a vision of reproductive justice. Most importantly, we stand in solidarity with all the other activists and partners who are fighting for Black women in the multiple ways that we show up. So I am so excited for you to join us. We got a great series. We hope you will join us, and I can't wait to get into this conversation.
Thank you. And next, we just want to set the tone for how we refer to reproductive justice. So, reproductive justice is the human right to control our sexuality, our gender, our work, and our reproduction. That right can only be achieved when all women and girls have the complete economic, social, and political power and resources to make healthy decisions about our bodies, our families, and our communities in all areas of our lives. And now we're just going to jump straight into questions. So, Dr. Bond, this first question is for you. What is the story of how the term reproductive justice came to be, and how does it differ from the more commonly used reproductive rights?
Sure, and thank you for having me. Many thanks to In Our Own Voice for In Our Own Voice Action Fund for inviting me to be a part of this important conversation. So as you said earlier, we came together around reproductive justice in 1994. And the reason we came together was very much so a political moment as we are currently in right now. And the political moment at that time was around universal health care reform. The then Clinton administration had put forth a proposal for universal health care reform and sent a representative to a conference that the 12 of us were gathered at in Chicago, a conference sponsored by the Ms. Foundation for Women and the Illinois Pro-Choice Alliance. And the representative presented this proposal, but the proposal didn't include any coverage for reproductive and sexual health care. And we were a collective of about 150 reproductive health and rights activists at the time, working on various reproductive and sexual health issues, everything from HIV/AIDS to abortion access and family planning. So we were working on a multitude of different issues, some of us working primarily domestically, others of us working both domestically and internationally. And so it was actually Mabel Thomas, who is one of the founding mothers, who kind of corralled us all together and said, you know, something's really wrong with this proposal that they have put forth. And we need to talk about it. We need to say something, because the people from our communities, the people that we know of, are being left out of this proposal. And so we gathered in Mabel's room and we talked about what was missing. We brought our own perspectives from our own personal lived experiences with trying to access reproductive and sexual health care and the varying forms of reproductive and sexual health, reproductive and sexual oppression that we had faced. And we also brought the voices of the individuals that we were working with at the grassroots. At the time, I was the executive director of the Chicago Abortion Fund. And so I knew from my work that not only were people struggling with trying to access safe and affordable abortion care, but that there were a myriad of other social issues that precluded them from leading reproductive and sexually healthy lives. And so we decided that we would take out a full page ad in the Washington Post and a similar ad in Roll Call, which is a DC-based newspaper. And we organized the voices of 836 women and got them to sign on to this signature ad that we crafted, where we talked about the fact that Black women had higher rates of maternal mortality and morbidity, that Black women had higher rates of fibroids. Black women died in higher rates from breast cancer, not because we contract breast cancer at a higher rate, but because the detection is often detected much later for Black women. So we talked about these things in this signature ad, and it ran in August of 1994. And then we also did a couple of other things, issued a statement in support of then U.S. Surgeon General Jocelyn Elders when she was being attacked for her comments about how to deal with substance use addiction, and also teaching young people about healthy sexual behavior, including masturbation. So we wrote a statement in support of her. And then we also held a press briefing in DC at the National Press Club around the signature ad that we had put forth. And over this time, I mean, I think each of us were working in some capacity through a very intersectional lens. And that is probably one of the most important things to understand about reproductive justice as a theoretical framework, is that it rests upon the human rights platform, and it also rests upon Black feminist thought. And from both of those, we get this understanding of intersectionality, that it is owing to individuals' multiple identities that they are oftentimes confronted with multiple forms of oppression, particularly for Black, Indigenous people of color, and that those oppressions happen simultaneously. And heavily drew upon the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, who is considered the brilliant mind who coined the term intersectionality. And also that reproductive justice rests upon four pillars. First is the right to have a child, and to have a child with an understanding that that includes individuals being able to have key decision making in their birthing experiences. And then the right not to have a child. And that includes not just access to abortion care, but access to person-controlled methods of contraception. And also connecting pregnancy prevention to prevention of HIV and other sexually transmitted infections. And then the third pillar is parenting the children that one has. And this means ensuring that we all have access to the social and economic supports that we need so that our families don't just survive, but thrive. And lastly, the fourth pillar, which was added in 2004, the right to bodily autonomy and sexual expression. And this pillar is really about acknowledging humans as sexual beings who experience sexual feelings, acknowledging the eroticism that permeates human bodies, and supporting individuals willingly seizing their human right to be mentally, physically, and spiritually fulfilled through the pleasures of sex and intimacy. Now, one of the key things to note in terms of reproductive justice as a theoretical framework, and the difference between reproductive justice and, say, reproductive rights, there are three commonly known frameworks now when we talk about issues of reproduction and sexuality. Reproductive health. Reproductive health is about individual service delivery. It is about connecting the social services that people need so that they can get the access, the health care, reproductive and sexual health care that they need. Reproductive rights is about public policy, and it's about legal advocacy using the U.S. Constitution to hold back infringements on people's ability to access reproductive and sexual health care. Reproductive justice is about movement building, using human rights standards, and trying to fend off the attacks on reproductive and sexual health care before they even start. And as I said, it applies an intersectional analysis. The last thing that I would say that's important to note in terms of the differences between these theoretical frameworks, we're hearing a new framework these days called reproductive freedom. And just to offer a little commentary, this is my opinion about this new framework that we are using. You may have heard in the public square that that political candidates were actually saying reproductive justice. But at some point, they pivoted and they are now saying reproductive freedom. One of the things that we have to keep in mind when we hear the term reproductive freedom is that that freedom is a misnomer. Because just like the term pro-choice, which implies that people have access to a place of options where they can exercise all of these choices, reproductive freedom implies that people have the freedom to make choices about their reproductive and sexual health. And in order to have that freedom, it necessitates the social and economic and political conditions for that to happen. And we know that that is not the case right now. So I think it's important for us to, as we hear these frameworks, and especially these new frameworks, understand what's really sustainable. And we need all three of the reproductive health, reproductive rights, and reproductive justice, because we need the healthcare providers, we need the attorneys and the policy folks and the researchers, and we also need the reproductive justice activists on the ground who are organizing and mobilizing people. But this reproductive freedom framework, I challenge us to think about whether or not that's actually sustainable and whether or not the freedom that is implied is the freedom that really exists. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah, you dropped some real gems there. Thank you. Anyone else want to chime in before we move to the next question?
How do you follow that? I mean,
Yeah.
mic has been dropped. That's all I could say.
Yeah, that was great. Trying to get it. Okay. I think this way we'll be able to see the questions and speakers. So in the wake of the overturning of Roe v. Wade, what do you feel are some of the most pressing challenges facing the reproductive justice movement today? And I'm gonna kick it to Dr. Bond again, but if anyone wants to chime in, would love your thoughts.
Thank you. I promise to be brief. The first thing that I think that we have to keep in mind in the wake of the overturning of Roe v. Wade is that Black, Indigenous people of color communities expected Roe v. Wade to be overturned. So this newfound agitation around Roe v. Wade being overturned for BIPOC communities and individuals, this was nothing new. We expected this to happen, and as a matter of fact, had been saying to our allies in the reproductive health and reproductive rights movements that we have to do something, and also lifting our voices to say that Roe was always the floor. It was never the ceiling, and that individuals in our communities always struggled with difficulties in accessing abortion care, even under Roe, owing to the Hyde Amendment, which precludes the use of Medicaid and forms of insurance that individuals have, federal employees, people in the armed forces, from using that coverage to get safe abortion care, only under certain exceptions. And so we have been saying that, you know, we need to have a concerted effort to repeal the Hyde Amendment. So here we sit now with Roe being overturned. Perhaps one of my biggest concerns is that we don't ask for too little. That now that Roe has been overturned, that we don't just say, well, can we get Roe reinstated? Roe was never enough. If we're going to make an ask, let's utilize what I say is my womanist utopian imagination. Let's ask for the whole kit and caboodle, including Roe v. Wade um, to be struck down, right? Including the repeal of Roe v. Wade, that we have a fully funded concerted effort to examine systemic racism and how white supremacy contribute to the high rates of maternal mortality and morbidity. Because we have a lot of money being thrown at it, but we still aren't dealing with the root cause, which is systemic racism and white supremacy. The last thing that I would add is that in this time of overturning Roe, that we understand that we are standing in the thick of this very interesting moment of white Christian nationalism that is impeding every area of what we thought was democracy. And I say thought was democracy and put it in quotes because, you know, those of us who come from BIPOC communities understand that even democracy has been a source of troubling and constant interrogation in our lives. So I will leave it there.
Thank you. I'll just repeat the question just so it's fresh for you, and then Ericka or Dr. Davis-Moss, please feel free. In the wake of the overturning of Roe versus Wade, what do you feel are some of the most pressing challenges facing the reproductive justice movement today?
I'll start. So what we know is that we have long had, significant disparities in maternal health. We have always had, issues with barriers to accessing healthcare and having more limited financial options for covering service, right? But in the wake of that, all we saw was it just opened the floodgates. Let's just put it that way. So now it's even more dire. It is even more of a devastating impact, and it's more immediate, right? So now we've heard about Amber Nicole Thurman and Candy Miller. So we're seeing the impact of what happens when people are criminalized and when you don't have the right or the access to timely care. But it's not just that law, right? We are also, faced with dealing with things like EMTALA, which is having an impact, and now they're trying to take away access to medication abortion. So I would say what we're really facing is that, to me, this is just the beginning and a floodgate of additional laws and policies that are going to continue to be passed, that are going to continue to put us in this very precarious situation, right? And, it goes without saying, who is going to be hurt the most? Who is going to be the most impacted? It's us.
I have just felt like a student here at the seat of Dr. Bond and Regina Davis-Moss, so I'm grateful to be a part of this conversation. The only thing that I want to add is, while we're watching the overturning of Roe v. Wade, we are also witnessing a wave of anti-trans legislation across the country, which is also a reproductive justice issue. That oftentimes is not considered when we talk about reproductive justice or even abortion rights, is very gendered. A lot of advocates will say, like, we need to fight for women and completely ignore that there's non-binary and trans people who also need access to abortion. But if folks are unable to get gender affirming care, that directly impacts their ability to live full and whole lives on their terms, which is against the tenets of reproductive justice. So my hope is, as we continue to fight for reproductive justice, that we are not just including queer and trans people, but that we are centering Black trans people, in particular Black trans women, who we are witnessing a genocide of due to white Christian nationalism that continues to perpetuate this idea of a gender binary.
Thank you. I think that was well put. So moving on, our next question is, what are some concrete policy solutions that can advance the reproductive justice agenda at the local, state, and national levels? And Regina, I'm going to ask you to start us off with this question.
Sure. So every 2 years ahead of the new Congress, in our own voice, along with Dr. Bond's organization, we publish a 70-something page document called the Black Reproductive Justice Policy Agenda. And it outlines over 50 policy recommendations addressing everything. There's not an issue in here that we haven't touched, right? And so when I talked about this a little bit, and I said we have the blueprint, we have a guidebook, so that when policymakers say, well, I don't really know what to do, that's just not true, So we've got this policy agenda. It touches on economic justice, it touches on the environment, it touches on IVF. It is very comprehensive. That is one. That's a landmark report, like I said, that is released every 2 years. But then we also have tools such as a legislative policy guide. So when we have legislators who want to get involved in this work and who don't understand what reproductive justice is, it provides an overview of that. It walks you through people that are doing the great work in various states, and as well as how to get involved in it. And so what we have tried to do is make it very difficult for elected officials and people to say that they don't know what to do and they don't know how to implement this work, because we know that it works. And we know that when people take this approach, which is much more expansive, which is much more culturally affirming, which is much more, gets all the things that we've been talking about, quality care, access to care, then we all thrive. This plain and simple.
Thank you. Anyone else want to chime in? All right.
I think Dr. Moss covered it all.
She does that. We love it. Okay, so I will push us to the next question. How do individuals and communities get involved in the fight for reproductive justice? And what are some effective strategies for advocacy and activism? And Eric, I'm going to ask you to take first stab at this question.
Sure. I think first and foremost, it's important to be looking at yourself and how you may be perpetuating reproductive injustice in your own life, how you may be impinging on someone's desires of not having children or to have children. What are some of the comments that you're making about people's bodies, about your own body? I think it definitely starts with the person in the mirror. And then in community, some organizations that I just want to lift up in the space is Ancient Song, which is a really incredible birth justice, birth worker program, training program. Also food justice programs. I'm not sure where everybody is located, but getting involved in food sovereignty and making sure that folks have accessible food options. As many of us live in segregated spaces across the United States, that directly impacts the food that we have access to, which directly impacts reproductive justice. So food justice programs, pantry programs, getting involved where you are. Shawnee Benton Gibson is a really good friend of mine who has lost a child to maternal mortality. She is doing a really amazing work in the New York, New Jersey area, but also just nationally. So I would definitely check her out. And there's a incredible trans midwife. Their name is Maria Goodman, and they have a book called Pregnant Together, and they also do a lot of programming for trans and queer folks who are trying to get pregnant. But those are just some of the ways I think folks can get involved in community, but the biggest one being to kind of look at who's in the mirror and, what are some of the ways that you may be impending the fight towards reproductive justice.
And if I might say this, is one of the things I find most inspiring about Dr. Bond's story is that when she came to the movement, she really just saw a need and acted. I don't mean to speak for her, but one of the things I'm always so amazed by is that she didn't consider herself an activist at the time. She just said this was a need, and she was compelled to act. And I think that's one of the most important things to remember is that you don't have to have a long history of being an activist. You don't have to be this person of influence. You just need to see a need and take action. And that can look a number of ways. That can be you just going to your community center. It could be you talking to the most influential person in your community who you know can inspire people to act. But the most important thing is that when you see an injustice or there's a cause that speaks to you, and just take that next step.
Thank you for that, Dr. Moss. I was just going to say that I think we all have to realize that the personal really is political. And when I came to this work, I didn't consider myself an activist per se, but I had my own lived experiences. I I had an experience of getting pregnant at 12 and needing an abortion the year after the Hyde Amendment was passed, and watching my mom scrape together the money to pay for that abortion. And we ate less food, and she struggled to pay the rent. And also being someone who didn't understand my body and having this aha moment when I went to a feminist women's clinic and had them show me how to track my menstrual cycle. So my point here is one way to, as individuals, to get involved in communities is you can start with your own circle of people and have these conversations about issues of reproductive and sexual health care. And you can have the conversations about politics and the current political moment. And ask your close friends about what do they think about what's happening around Roe v. Wade being overturned and around um, uh, attempts to prevent LGBTQIA individuals from accessing the healthcare that they need. I think first we have to begin to have the conversations. It feels like we've become very comfortable in one way of organizing through social media and armchair organizing, but true organizing is really heart to heart. It is about relationship building. It is about going out to be with people in the community and having the conversations and checking in and seeing what's going on with people in their communities first, and then seeing how there can be some cohesion, some collective organizing and mobilizing around some of the issues. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all. So we have one more question for the panelists. And before I read that question, just want to say if anyone has questions that you want to ask, we're going to do a quick Q&A session shortly. So please put your questions in the chat. And also, Dr. Bond mentioned, getting informed and being able to have these conversations with your communities. And for everyone who did RSVP through the link, afterwards, we're going to send you some information, some more information just to get yourself educated and give you talking points so that when you're talking to people in your communities, you can have facts. Because sometimes you know how you feel, but you don't know how to back it up. And so we want to make sure that you have the information to carry these conversations through. So please feel free to drop questions in the chat. And I'm going to share one more time. So our last question is and this is for everyone, what is your vision for the future of the reproductive justice movement, and what gives you hope in the face of ongoing challenges?
I'm gonna let you two go first because I feel like I've been talking way too much. Let you all go first.
Ericka, you want to start and then I'll go next.
Sure. I really appreciate and admire the work of Miriam Makaba that says that hope is a practice. So even when, because people oftentimes will ask me, what keeps you hopeful? How do you stay hopeful? And it really is a practice to return to, because I don't always feel hopeful. I don't think anybody always feels hopeful. But to return to and to practice hope and really be in a conversation that things can shift and they do shift. And our ancestors have shown us that over and over and over again, that nothing stays the same, that resistance is necessary. What was the other part of the question? The question went away. That was where I was at, was hope. And then what was the other part? Oh, your vision for reproductive justice movement. My vision is for Black pregnant people to walk into birthing spaces, hospitals, wherever it might be, and come out with their child and themselves also alive. That's my vision for the future, and that Black, queer, and trans people have accessible birthing care, and that we are able to have babies in a way that is actually accessible financially, because it's incredibly expensive to go through IVF, even if you do have insurance, or to go through IUI. There's a lot of hoops that you have to jump through. It can be incredibly ableist. As somebody that lives with a chronic illness, there's lots of horrible questions that folks will ask in the birthing world just because you have a chronic illness. So I cannot imagine for folks with other disabilities what kind of questions that they're receiving. So my hope is that folks are able to have children on their terms, especially Black, queer, and trans people, or not have kids, but to have that knowledge. And then as a sex educator, that everybody knows how their bodies operate and what they need for their bodies. If they desire of pleasure, then they're able to have pleasure. If they're not desiring of pleasure, that they're able to make that clear and live in a world that actually honors that. And I would be remiss to not mention this, but to live in a world that does not only not only kind of debate genocide, but lives in a world where genocide doesn't exist, where folks actually have bodily autonomy, and we are honoring of all people's bodies, not just certain folks. That's the kind of future that I imagine, a reproductive justice future.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
The future, or my vision for reproductive justice, is one where all four of the pillars that reproductive justice rests upon is actualized, that everybody has the right to have a child, that everybody has the right, is able to realize the right to not have a child, and that everyone has the social economic resources they need to thrive, and that everybody is able to, has the human right to exercise bodily autonomy and to experience sexual pleasure. And at the same time, I also envision a world where, as we are able to realize reproductive justice, that reproductive justice becomes the term that everybody is using to describe forms of reproductive and sexual oppression, and also to talk about this world that exist where everybody is able to be self-determining about their reproductive and sexual health. Last thing I'll add to that is that, there can't truly be complete reproductive and sexual healing until there is some discussion about restoration and reparation. So at some point, we will have to talk about the historical reproductive and sexual oppression that Black, Indigenous people of color have had to endure, and to talk about what it looks like to restore us from that generational trauma to a place of healing.
Beautiful. So my vision, and I forgot the rest of the question, but how I really look at this is not so much um, situated in reproductive justice as it is just a way of living, right? And so for me, reproductive justice is being able to ultimately believe that life is trustworthy, that you can walk it out in every aspect of your life, right? So it's being able to feel empowered, that we have everything that we need to be able to handle whatever comes, right? So then that doesn't mean that life is always good. It doesn't mean that there won't be moments where our breath won't be taken away. But it does mean that we can expect to have the resources and everything that we need so we can get through it. And so that ties to all those different ways I talked about it: education, income, the environment, knowing that you have food, knowing that you have access to care, knowing that you are living in a safe community and not worrying about intimate partner violence and all the other things, right? Because that is what wellness for me is for Black women, girls, and gender expansive people. And that means you have physical, mental, economic well-being. And that, for me, is how you can exhale and breathe in all parts of your life.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Beautifully put. Okay, so that was our last question for the panelists. So now going to turn it over to my colleague Anya to share some of the questions that we had in the comments. And if you do have a question that you haven't gotten to type yet, please feel free and we'll try and see if we can get to it before we close. So Anya, go ahead.
Awesome. Thanks, Montserrat. The first question is for Dr. Bond from Cheyenne, and it is, do you feel that the work of Black founding mothers of the reproductive justice movement has been accurately documented?
Thank you for that question. So some of you may know that we are currently in the 30th anniversary, or recognizing the 30th anniversary of the founding of the RJ movement. And I have to say, up until the 30th anniversary in July of this year, it hadn't felt like the founding mothers had been recognized. But, thanks to In Our Own Voice and their amazing work to capture our stories, it is now being accurately documented. And so the women who were a part of this monumental lift are getting their stories heard, and the faces are being put to their names, connected with their names. So yeah, I have to thank In Our Own Voice for taking on that momentous project.
It was our pleasure. I mean, we do not want the reproductive justice movement to be co-opted. We don't want these stories to be erased. We want them to be honored and held with the care that they deserve. And so it's our honor to do that.
And I know it has been mentioned a couple of times already, but I do just have to unmute myself to say, Dr. Bond, as a young Black woman in this country, it is beyond gratifying to be in space with someone like you who has been doing this work for so long, and you are so appreciated. And I am happy that your story and the story of the other 11 founding mothers are being told. We've been able to watch archival footage from like Able Mabel and stuff like that, and it gives me chills to know that there are women who've been fighting for me before I was even born, or before they knew. You don't know me, but you've been working for us, and we really, really do appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Montserrat. The second question is from Trisha, and they say, why aren't we suing ... class action lawsuits for the harm done to women and birthing people since Roe v. Wade was overturned? And this can be for any participants.
Well, I mean, we do, we have lots of cases. We have organizations like the National Women's Law Center, and we have Center for Reproductive Rights. We have organizations that are bringing lawsuits. But there's no way to say this other than we live in a country where some people are valued and some people are not. And some people have more resources and more political will and a lot of other things that make it difficult and challenging to prevail.
And I think we have to look for ways beyond our injustice system to have restoration, because our legal system can be more harmful than it is good, and also cause a lot of roadblocks for folks who are unable to access it. Even organizations, multi-million-dollar organizations, oftentimes cannot handle the legal costs to sue because it is so inaccessible. So I think Dr. Bond mentioned conversations about restoration. I think we have to look at other ways to have justice beyond the legal system.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
Thanks so much, both. I have a few anonymous questions coming in, so I'm going to read them as they come in. The first one is a question for Regina. As you have conversations about reproductive justice with policymakers and other people in the political space, do you run into people who don't see the need for reproductive justice when we already have reproductive rights, and how do you push back?
So that's a great question. What I run into is that people don't know what reproductive justice is, surprisingly, because, it's just like often what we see in marketing. The more you keep saying a word over and over again, the more people tend to repeat that word. So you have a lot of marketing around reproductive freedom, right? But when I get in there and I say, but do you know about reproductive justice? And do you know that this was a term that was coined 30 years ago? And here's what it is. And here's why it actually applies to a lot of the work you do. And when I say, hey, you're leading legislation on, pick an issue. It might be gun safety, or it could be, clean air and water. And when I can explain to them that reproductive justice encompasses all of that, then it's like, oh wow, this is a, a better framework for me. It's more expansive, right? Because let's just think politically for a minute. If they live in a state where, their constituency may not want them to be, advocating strongly for abortion rights, wouldn't it be much more palatable to talk about reproductive justice, to talk about how expansive it is, to talk about how it's much more than abortion? Because that's what we've been saying the whole time. So I would say that's really my challenge when I'm on the Hill, or when I'm talking to electeds or on the administration, is to really educate them on what reproductive justice is, and to get them to stop thinking that reproductive justice is only about abortion.
Thanks, Regina. The next anonymous question is, what are some formal trainings that we can do as researchers or clinicians who want to become more politically engaged? I've been exploring postdoctoral activities to get involved with and have not found many specifically centered on sexual and reproductive health.
Well, I think we're always in need of RJ-centered research, and RJ-centered research that really has an approach to authentically involve the communities of individuals who are a part of the research. And when I say that, I mean even from the point of the research design. And, I could imagine that In Our Own Voice might need some research done to complement the work of its Action Fund and even its C3 arm. I know it at Ivy Interfaith Voices for Reproductive Justice, we're always interested in research because we don't have enough researchers researching our issues the way that we need them to. At IVRJ, we actually have an institutional review board where we are able to review people's research. We are the first federally recognized IRB that reviews research through a reproductive and sexual justice lens. So that means that we can review your research, and you can say it was peer reviewed by a committee of academic scholars and community members, and that creates the pathway for grassroots activists to be the leaders of their own research, to be the lead investigators on their own research.
Thanks so much, Dr. Bond. I have a couple more anonymous questions coming in. I have one for Ericka. Ericka, you are very active online and on social media, and the question is, do you feel that it's more difficult to hone community around reproductive justice in the digital world, especially with the rise of AI and algorithm bias? And what value do you feel that in-person activations play in comparison for reproductive justice?
I personally don't feel, as a professor, I feel more concerned about AI than online. I'm more concerned about my students using AI to write papers, but in building community, I feel like people are being authentic. I think with building community, you have to make it clear that that's who you are and what you stand for. So I think even before AI was something that folks were talking about, people will steal folks' intellectual property, and I think that's what's challenging. Is like, how do you build community in a world where it functions inside of capitalism and folks are trying to, in this very nonsensical world of social media, trying to build followers and things like that, and then it's a lot of repeating the things that other people have said or just completely stealing their content entirely. So I think that's challenging, but I've been able to build a really beautiful community around sexual health, gender justice, reproductive justice. And I do think that online spaces are not dead. I think that they're absolutely necessary because they're accessible, more accessible than in person, because you're able to connect obviously with people all over the world versus, who is right there in that particular area. But also for folks who are living with disabilities and may, that's the way that they organize is from home. Right. And that has been some of the most effective organizing, from disability justice movements to Black Lives Matter. A lot of that was done online. So I definitely think that it's important and possible. I think you just have to be protective of the work that you put out and what you share, and find creative ways to protect it, because AI, but also because humans will try to take things. I hope that answers the question.
It definitely did. Thank you.
Cool.
I have two more anonymous questions, and then we're going to round it out because I know we're 2 minutes before the end of this. So the first question is for Dr. Bond, and then the second question that I'll say after Dr. Bond gives her answers for all participants. So this first question is for Dr. Bond. Could you please discuss the pivotal role that the interfaith community has previously contributed to the reproductive justice movement? And then what do you feel their role, the interfaith community, is in this crucial political moment?
Ooh, that's a big question to answer in about 30 seconds.
Yes.
Sorry.
Take your time. We can at least go to like 8:08, 8:10.
So the religious community has been hesitant to be involved in the reproductive health rights and justice movements. And I think some of that is owing to how the conversation through the reproductive health and reproductive rights movements have always centered around abortion. The beauty of the reproductive justice movement is it allows us to have this conversation from a myriad of starting places, not just abortion. we can have a conversation about maternal child health, right? And cover everything from contraception to family planning to abortion access to the social and economic and political needs that conditions that people need so that their families can thrive. Our work at Interfaith Voices for Reproductive Justice is really to engage in this kind of culture shift and narrative change, to have both religious scholars who train the pastors leading the churches to think differently about how they engage their congregants, and to really understand that congregants come to church and they bring their full selves. And how do you provide pastoral care to someone who's dealing with miscarriage, or how it should be the place where someone can come and talk with their religious leader about having to make the decision about whether or not to carry a pregnancy to term. The church should be a place that talks about healthy sexuality and also human reproduction, because that is the way most of us got here, through sex. So, and to talk about how sex is considered sacred and healthy, and how we all have free will, and how we all have moral authority to make lives about our lives and bodies. When it comes to the forms of reproductive and sexual oppression that we are experiencing right now, and even Roe v. Wade, to talk about that as sinful, to talk about that as a slap in the face of the free will that God has given us when we think through the lens of the Christian tradition. And so there is a role for the church, and in particular, the Black church, given the historical reproductive and sexual oppression against Black bodies. The Black church has to take up the mantle of having this conversation about human reproduction and sexuality.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ron.
Question.
Appreciate those who've stayed over time. Our last question is for all participants, and it is, how can we more effectively empower young people to engage with and advocate for reproductive justice, rather than, and this is some of the stuff we were talking about in the beginning, rather than limiting their focus to just abortion and reproductive rights?
Well, I mean, one of the ways we try to do it is to help young people see themselves in reproductive justice, right? So I know for young people, top of mind for them is things like the economy, like student loans, being able to pay their bills and, you know, have a job and afford the ridiculous price of eggs right now. But you know, I think that number one, acknowledging the issues that are top of mind for them, and then helping them understand how it's connected, right? Because the economic justice and reproductive justice are inextricably linked. Like, economic justice is the foundation, one of the foundations for reproductive justice, because that's largely is a lot of reasons why people have to make those difficult decisions. So, you know, that's one way we do that. Another way we do that is just trying to, you know, reiterate how important it is, when as soon as you can, you're of an age to vote, because that's actually how we achieve that goal of reproductive justice. And really just, you know, In Our Own Voice does that in a number of ways. We have our Next Generation Leadership Institute. So we're training the next generation of leaders, because really it doesn't matter to us, you know, what you do once you learn what reproductive justice is, right? You don't have to become an activist. We just want you to apply the lens in whatever work you do, whether you become a doctor, a lawyer, whatever. Because once you learn reproductive justice, I assure you, you know, your purview about injustice and human rights and all of that will be expanded, and you'll do it in everything you do.
I was just going to say, I think young people get this work so much faster than a much older adults. There's a lot more in adults' way to understand the necessity of reproductive justice, but young people are like, yep, that makes sense. And I think it's important to, in this country, that we be working to mandate sex education across the country, because so many states are doing sex education any way they want to, completely leaving out science, and folks are not learning about their bodies and how they operate. Dr. Bond mentioned one of my heroes, Dr. Jocelyn Elders, who spoke about the importance of masturbation in schools, and that essentially is what fired her and then got her fired in the 1990s. And that is what we continue to see, is the really pushing away of having sex education in schools. And I think that is just necessary to folks' understandings about their body and understanding bodily autonomy and also reproductive. So I think a mandate of sex education needs to happen in more conversations about sex in beginning in elementary school, not just in high school, as when folks oftentimes want to start having those conversations or feel most comfortable. But by that point, young people are 14, 15, they've already lived 15 years on the planet without any conversations that their body belongs to them. So we have to start much sooner.
Thank you. Dr. Bond, did you want to chime in?
I don't have much more to add except to say that the beauty of the reproductive justice movement is that it continues to evolve. And I think most of us have done a fair job of moving moving out of the way and being supportive of the leadership of younger leaders. And I think we need to continue to do that. We also need to figure out, how do we have this open kind of intergenerational exchange where we're learning from each other about how this work is done. But you know, a great deal of the expansion of the theoretical framework has to be a great deal of the credit for the expansion of the theoretical framework over the past few years has to be given to the younger leaders.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you all so, so much. This has been a great evening. Great to hear from you all. Thank you for everyone who participated by, asking questions and leaving comments, and being engaged. So we are going to let you go really quickly, but just want to, call everyone in. And so we want to call people in to get involved. And so we have a few bullet points here on how to get involved, although this is obviously not expansive, but this fight is really requires collective action, and we can't sit on the sidelines. So the first thing we need to do is support candidates who support us. A plug, In Our Own Voice Action Fund has shared an inaugural slate of candidates that the organization is supporting for this election cycle. Top of the ticket is Vice President Kamala Harris for president, but also some local candidates. So please visit blackrjaction.org to find more about the candidates. But there are 5 endorsed candidates, but there are down ballot races everywhere. I know we had someone joining from Missouri, someone joining from South Carolina, I believe. And so please read the ballots and where you're from to find out who's on the ballot and who really supports reproductive justice policies. And we also want people to stay informed. As I mentioned, we'll be sending some information out via email, but we also think it's worth taking a look at the reproductive justice policy agenda that was created within Our Own Voice and 2 other organizations, including Dr. Bond's organization, Interfaith Voices for Reproductive Justice. And then keep up with In Our Own Voice Action Fund. This is a 4-part speaker series. This was session 1, and I think it was a great introduction, but session 2 is going to be about understanding the threat, a Black woman's response to Project 2025. This is, a real document that was written, and we need to inform ourselves of what it says and how we're going to respond. And lastly, we just ask that you spread the word, tell people that you attended this session and they should check out the next one. Tell people that, reproductive justice is something that they should be aware of and something they should educate themselves about. And as the panelists said, like being in community with people and having conversations. Ericka talked about, involving yourself in local organizations, whether it's from, a food bank to anything where people are on ground. Just reach out to people and spread the word. So if you want to stay connected with In Our Own Voice and with our panelists, we have their information here. So please feel free to follow them on social media, and we will be in touch. So we thank everybody for your attendance and hope everyone has a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
And thank you again to the panelists. This was great. It was really great. And I'm going to end the meeting. So have a good night.